Oh my gosh, is it so awesome to see so many of you here for this webinar. I am really, really excited for what we're going to be discussing over the next hour. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And we are now in 21 different states. We have just expanded into Michigan and New Jersey, which means we are now in enough states that we cover something like 54 or 55% of the population of the United States. And we're really, really excited to tell you about all that we are learning. I am going to share my screen so that we can go ahead and get started. What you have coming to you today, you can see on this slide. I'm going to start with a very quick introduction of our work at the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are brand new to our work, please know this is not a really long, in-depth discussion of our work. We have links to other webinars that give you that. Today, I'm just going to spend 4 or 5 minutes quickly going over our work. What we're going to spend the bulk of today on is what you see at number 2 there, which is a deep dive into our brand new, hot off the presses data from New Jersey and Michigan. And we're going to go over what we're seeing in our voter file analysis there and the opportunities that you as volunteers and donors can have in these two important states this year. And then finally, as Shannon mentioned, we will have time for questions at the end. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. Shannon might answer it now in the Q&A, or she might hold on and toss it to me at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, in a nutshell, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we find people who care deeply about climate and the environment who aren't voting, and we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's what we do. We find environmentalists who aren't voting, and we turn them into better voters. And the reason we do this is because it turns out that millions, in fact, over 10 million already registered voters who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their number one priority, over 10 million of them never vote. They don't even vote in presidential elections. And obviously, when we're talking about midterm years or odd years like this, the number of non-voting environmentalists gets much, much larger than that. And so this is a huge pool of potential political power that we in the climate movement really need to tap into. And so this is what we are doing at the Environmental Voter Project. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't endorse candidates. We don't even try to convince people to care more about climate or the environment. Instead, all we focus on is identifying and then mobilizing these tens of millions of non-voting environmentalists who are already persuaded, they're already with us. And we just need to try to change their habits, their behavior, to turn them into new voters and then consistent voters. We are now doing this, as I mentioned, in 21 states. These are the 21 states that we are active in. We have kept all of the 19 states that we had been working in. We didn't leave any of them, and we are adding Michigan and New Jersey. What this means is that in 2025, we will likely be targeting close to 6 million unique individual low propensity environmental voters. These are all people who are registered to vote, highly likely to list climate or the environment as their number one priority, yet we can tell by looking at their public voting histories that they're unlikely to vote in their general elections this year. That's a huge pool of potential political power. Okay, how do we find these people and then mobilize them to vote and change the electorate? Well, again, this is a very, very brief intro, so I'm only going to really briefly go over that. But it's a 4-step process. First, we work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files. What this enables us to do is assign a unique score to each individual voter across our 21 states, telling us the likelihood of them listing climate or the environment as their number one issue. So we've assigned a unique score to hundreds of millions, like well over 100 million voters, telling us how likely they are on a scale of 0 to 100 to list climate or the environment as their top priority. And we've tested and retested and refined these models until they've become frighteningly accurate. What we can then do is cross-reference those super environmentalists we found with public voting records so that we can just focus in on the ones of these super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. Because whether you vote or not is public record. We don't need fancy data scientists to help us figure out that part. All right, so that gets us to the end of step one here. We've got this huge pool of super environmentalists who are really unlikely to vote, and we've identified them as individuals. So now we can go to step two, mobilization. And what's great now is we don't need to persuade these people of anything. We know that they care deeply about climate and the environment, but are unlikely to vote. So now the sky's the limit when it comes to messaging. We don't even need to talk about climate or the environment. And so we run hundreds of randomized control trials, figuring out which messages work best with which subgroups of these voters to do one thing and one thing only, and that is get them to vote for the first time and then eventually become consistent voters. We work with now over 7,000 volunteers to canvass, call, and postcard these voters. We as a staff also run direct mail and digital ad campaigns to these voters. And we have extraordinary results, which you're going to learn about in a minute. That brings us to step three, habit reinforcement. The way to turn a non-voter or an infrequent voter into someone who votes consistently is to talk to them more than once every 2 years. And so we take habit reinforcement really seriously. We work year-round in federal, state, local, general, primary, special elections. We're going to be active in close to 300 elections just this year. Just this year. And that's not because all 300 of them are really important for climate policymaking. I freely admit that's not the case. But they're all crucially important for building good voting habits. Because eventually we're trying to get to step four, and that is change the electorate. Right now, there are too few voters who care deeply about climate and the environment. So anybody can run for office, and whether they're a climate leader or not, they all really are able to ignore our priorities because there aren't enough of us voting. But if we change that, if we dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who vote, politicians will have to follow, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. That's our ultimate goal. If you want to get some more information about how we go about doing our work, you can find it at this link, environmentalvoter.org/about. And I know there are some other links that have been shared in the chat that go into more detail about these processes that I just walked through. All right, very briefly, we measure our impact in two ways. First is through randomized control trials. What randomized control trials allow us to do is isolate our sole impact on turnout while controlling for all the work that other campaigns do. How do we do that? Well, before we talk to any of these low propensity environmental voters, we randomly set aside a whole bunch of them in a control group. And then after the election, we compare turnout in those two groups to see what our sole impact was. And we, just over 2020 to 2023, have increased turnout in hundreds of elections. But in dozens of them, that increase was so much, and we were talking to so many voters, that we achieved what's known as statistical significance, which means we can prove that we were solely responsible for that increase in turnout, and the increase was not due to random occurrence or some outside variable. And as you'll see, in 2020, and 21, and 22, and 23, we increased turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in general elections, 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. These are huge numbers in this business. And just you wait. Our 2024 results are almost complete. We're still waiting for 3 states to update their voter files. We'll be able to announce our 2024 results probably in 5 or 6 weeks, and it looks like last year was our best year yet. The second way we measure our impact is over the long term. Since we launched, the Environmental Voter Project has communicated with 10.5 million unique individual voters. We tagged them in voter files, and we have tracked them over time. As of about 10, 11 months ago, so we're about to update this data, 1.8 million of those low propensity environmental voters had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, state election, and even local election. 1.8 million. Now, to be clear, this isn't as precise a metric as the last one, the randomized control trial. I can't claim that EVP is solely responsible for turning 1.8 million non-voters into super voters, but we were pretty darn responsible. There's no other group that's now been active in over 2,000 elections over the last 9 years. This is what building good habitual voters looks like. All right, if you'd like more information about our results, boy, have we got a lot of studies and reports for you. We publish everything because we know if you're dedicating your volunteer time or your funding to someone's work, you deserve to know whether it works or not. And so we put all this stuff down in writing and post it on our website. All right, that's it. That's it about the Environmental Voter Project. Now let's nerd out and go into data in Michigan and New Jersey, and then we'll have that Q&A session. But again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A folder. Shannon will either answer them now or hold them for that Q&A session at the end. Okay, we have, as I mentioned, hot off the presses, new voter data from these predictive models that we've built in all 21 of our states. But today we're going to talk about Michigan and New Jersey. This year, in 2025, we at the Environmental Voter Project are going to be targeting almost 360,000 voters in Michigan. These are people who are registered to vote, highly likely to not just care about climate or the environment, but listed as their #1 priority. Yet, we can tell from looking at their public voting histories that they're unlikely to vote in any of their elections this year. How big a number is that? Well, for some context, obviously presidential years are very different from odd years, but only 5.7 million ballots were cast in Michigan in the presidential election last November. And so the fact that we are targeting 360,000 unlikely to vote climate first registered voters, that is such a big number. That would equal 6.3, 6.4% of all ballots that were cast in the presidential election. So that can make a huge, huge difference in a state where, oh my gosh, are the margins really close. Now, what do we have coming up on the election calendar in Michigan this year? A whole bunch of cities have mayoral elections: Detroit, Lansing, Sterling Heights, and others. These are important for multiple reasons. One, a lot of important climate and environmental policy is made at the municipal level. We're talking about zoning laws, traffic laws, open space laws, setback laws. This is really, really important stuff. But two, when we look ahead to 2026, Michigan will probably be the swing state that people focus on the most, because there will be a wide open U.S. Senate race. Senator Peters just announced that he's not going to run again. There will be a wide open gubernatorial election because Gretchen Whitmer's term limited out. There will be, currently, the Cook Political Report says there will be 5 competitive House districts. Now, obviously, a lot can change between now and then, but 5 is so big that it means Michigan is tied for 3rd in the entire country by having the most competitive U.S. House districts. So when we look ahead to those really, really important elections coming up in 2026, just a year and a half from now, Well, the best way to make sure we can flood the electorate with climate voters then is to start reaching them now in these Detroit and Lansing and Sterling Heights and other elections. Elections that are really easy and cheap to communicate with voters on. This is our cheapest, best, most efficient opportunity to make brand new voters heading into 2026. Okay, who are these people? Who are these low propensity environmental voters in Michigan? Well, I'd like you to look at the bottom of this slide. First, look at this line up here that says reg voters. What this is a percentage breakdown of various demographic groups when you look at all registered voters in Michigan. So this is how you read this chart. If you look here where I'm circling, 18 to 24-year-olds make up 8.7% of registered voters in Michigan. 25 to 34-year-olds make up 16.8%. And then you'll see we get into sex data and race data. I wanted to put that there because that's a baseline. I want you to think about that baseline. That's the demographic distribution of registered voters in Michigan. Now look at the line below it that says LPEVs. That stands for low propensity environmental voters. This is the first thing I want you to see. Look at that. Among the youngest voters in Michigan, there are actually fewer of them, or they make up a smaller percentage of low propensity environmental voters than they do in the overall electorate. If you've been following EVP for a while, this might surprise you. This is new. We are used to pretty much always seeing data that shows us, you know what, these low propensity environmental voters are always disproportionately young because young people are the most likely to list climate as their top priority. It's not the case anymore. As many of us learned last fall in the presidential election, demography is no longer destiny in American politics. It's really hard to look at a single demographic group and have a good idea of the way that they are going to vote. And the group that has perhaps changed the most and changed the fastest is really young people. Really, really young people. And we see that here. Now, when you get into 25 to 34-year-olds, that's when you start seeing it be disproportionately represented among environmentalists. Part of what's going on here is you're seeing the age split of people who came of age during the era of Donald Trump versus people who came of age during the era of Barack Obama or George W. Bush. These 18 to 24-year-olds who only know Trumpian politics, they're pretty much dead even, especially men, when you're looking at presidential and US Senate results. And that's why we're seeing a lot of changes in our data as well. But as you can see, 25 to 34-year-olds, 35 to 49-year-olds really are disproportionately represented among these low propensity environmental voters. And then it doesn't go down that much the older you get. And this is because we are seeing a huge bump in 65-year-olds and older who care deeply about climate and the environment. Now, it doesn't show up in this data as a huge bump because those people are also largely, although not all, they're largely good voters. But we are seeing a huge, huge number of grandparents in particular who care deeply about climate and the environment, especially women. And you'll see that in some data coming up soon. All right, now let's look at the gender gap. I use the term gender gap because it's sort of a commonly used term of art, but I want to be clear. This is sex data, not gender data. Voter files and states usually ask people for their sex rather than their gender. You'll see, if you look at all registered voters in Michigan, there's only a 2.5-point gender gap. Yeah, there are slightly more women registered to vote than men, but only slightly. But now look at our target population of low propensity environmental voters. It's 2-to-1 women. 2-to-1. It goes from being a 2.5-point gender gap to a 32-point gender gap. That's huge. That is huge. And what I want you to keep in mind over the next 5 or 10 minutes as we dig into this Michigan data and then New Jersey data is this gender gap. This is now maybe the defining demographic variable. This is the great sorting variable in the climate and environmental movement. Women, especially middle-aged and older women, are much, 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 much more likely to list climate and other environmental issues as their top priority, not only than men are, but than any demographic group is. All right, if we look at the race breakdowns, we don't see a lot of really dramatic differences, but it's worth pointing some stuff out because, again, this is a change from what we've seen in the past. You'll see these low propensity environmental voters are disproportionately Asian American and Pacific Islander, almost twice as likely or they're almost twice as prevalent in our population. One thing that has changed is in the past, we've seen that Black voters are overrepresented in our target universes. That's less and less the case, especially among young voters. And again, this mimics a lot of what we're seeing outside of the environmental movement, just as progressive and conservative constituencies start resorting themselves. All right, let's get a little bit deeper into some demographic breakdowns here. So here, what you're looking at is a combination of age and sex data. So you'll see 18 to 24-year-old males, 18 to 24-year-old females, and then you can see it go across here. The orange bars are what it looks like among all registered voters in Michigan. The green bars are our target population. Okay, so what's the first thing that pops out here? You can see that gender gap that I had mentioned before, especially among 25 to 34-year-olds and 35 to 49-year-olds. Just a huge, huge gender gap. Where look, among 35 to 49-year-olds, only 13.5% are men, but 24.3% of the low propensity environmentalists are female 35 to 49-year-olds. That's just huge, huge. All right, let's look at race and sex, okay? So among registered voters in Michigan, 1.5% of them are AAPI men. 2.2% of the low propensity environmental voters in Michigan are AAPI men. So, in addition to the gender gap, which you'll see, we still see among white voters and among AAPI voters, really, really big gender gap. In fact, we see the gender gap across all races. What's really, really interesting is that the only thing that, at least in Michigan, the only variable that is stronger than the gender gap is AAPI voters. AAPI voters are disproportionately represented in our target population. And what I mean by it being stronger than the gender gap is even among men, even among men, AAPI voters are overrepresented when you look at environmentalists as compared to the overall electorate. It's really, really interesting. Okay, finally, let's look at age and race. I know this is a lot of data, but if you come to an EVP webinar, you know that you're going to nerd out on data. All right, what do we see here? Well, we see, again, Black voters are underrepresented among these low propensity environmental voters now, especially young Black voters. See, it's a little less as you get older, but especially among young Black voters. And we didn't put the numbers for all of these bars because it would just look like spaghetti. All right, another thing to point out is among white voters, these low propensity environmentalists, or Yes, white voters are underrepresented among these low propensity environmentalists as well, but only if you look at sort of the ends of the demographic chart, really young people and older people. If you look again at that 25 to 34-year-old range and the 35 to 49-year-old range, it's a different story. You can see that's where a lot of the environmental voters are. And then again, you can see among AAPI voters, this huge bump. And so what this story tells us as a whole is that really the variable with the most predictive power, if you're trying to find low propensity environmental voters, at least the demographic variable, is gender or sex. And then after that, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, and in particular, if we're talking about gender, in that 25 to 49 range. Now, when we are identifying voters, we use thousands of variables, lots of consumer and behavioral data points. We don't just use demographic variables, but I want you to think about this changing sort of face of the electorate. This is something that we learned just a few months ago in the presidential election, when Donald Trump pretty much split young men with Kamala Harris. It's not as simple as turn out all the young people and that's good for progressives. Turn out all the old people and that's good for conservatives. Turn out this, turn out that. No, as I mentioned before, demography is no longer destiny except in a few rare occasions, which we've brought up for the environmental movement here. All right. As we look at the congressional districts in Michigan, I'm only going to spend a little bit of time on this because I do want to get to New Jersey. You'll see how many targets we've identified in each of Michigan's 13 congressional districts. Now, I want to be clear. If you are unlikely to vote in 2025, that's very different from being unlikely to vote in 2026. So when we come around to next year's midterms, we're going to have different numbers of targets. These numbers are going to be smaller in each of these congressional districts. But for the purposes of today, I wanted to isolate the 5 congressional districts that are currently anticipated to be really competitive. And that is 3, 4, 7, 8, and 10. And you can see the huge numbers of targets we've identified in these very competitive congressional districts. And again, as a reminder, these people are already registered to vote. They list climate as their #1 priority. Yet in 2025, they don't have a history of ever voting in odd years. Best estimates, and we're going to use more than best estimates, we're going to look at individuals' voting histories, but best estimates is that next year in 26, our target populations will be about 2/3 this size in each of these districts. All right. So in Michigan, as we think of 2025, when we have all these mayorals and some special elections coming up, we are looking to raise $250,000 to $300,000. This will pay not only for the phone campaigns, the server time that we need for all of our volunteers to make calls around primaries and general elections. It will also help us run digital ads, direct mail, and possibly some canvassing and postcarding. We're going to have to dig further into this brand new data to see if we'll be able to do that in Michigan. This is what we are looking to raise. I'm going to say this again at the end, but if you are interested in supporting our voter turnout work in Michigan, we have a unique link just for Michigan donations that can be shared in the chat here. Anything that is donated through that link, and the sky's the limit, there's no max donation, will go only to our efforts in Michigan. All right, let's jump into New Jersey. Oh my gosh, do we have a lot of targets in New Jersey. Almost twice as many as we identified in Michigan. We're going to be targeting almost 630,000 already registered super environmentalists in New Jersey this year who are unlikely to vote in this fall's gubernatorial election. And we know that because we're looking at their previous voting history. That is a huge number. In the last gubernatorial election in New Jersey, which was super tight, by the way. It was decided by 3.2 percentage points. Only 2.6 million people voted. So that means our target population of people we are targeting at the Environmental Voter Project this year is so big that it equals a quarter of all ballots that were cast last time there was a gubernatorial election in New Jersey. That is huge. We could have an enormous impact. Yes, it's going to be expensive, or not expensive. It's going to be inexpensive compared to what most organizations do, but it's going to be expensive compared to what I just showed you in Michigan. But oh my gosh, do we have an opportunity to change everything? We're going to have gubernatorial elections plus a whole bunch of other statewide office elections in New Jersey this year. The state assembly has elections. Multiple big cities are having mayoral elections. The primary is on June 10th. The general is on November 4th. All right. When we look at the demographic breakdown of our target voters in New Jersey, you see some similar things to what we saw in Michigan, although young voters are almost as well represented, really young voters are almost as well represented in our target population as they are in the overall electorate. So we haven't seen as much of a shift among young voters in New Jersey as we saw in Michigan and some other states. And again, look at that group of 65 and up. And just imagine what that might look like if we got rid of the low propensity part of environmental voters and we were just identifying all environmental voters. It would be huge. What we're seeing in our data is that people 65 and older in New Jersey and a whole bunch of our other states are quickly becoming the age group that is most likely to list climate or the environment as their top priority. All right, now look at the gender gap. New Jersey has a pretty big gender gap in their baseline of registered voters. You can see it's about 5 percentage points, but oh my gosh, it expands to 30 points among our target population. Again, sex is the big sort of sorting variable. It's a really strongly predictive variable when it comes to not finding people who care about climate and the environment, but finding people who prioritize it as their number one issue. As you can see, similar to what we saw in Michigan, AAPI voters are disproportionately represented in our target population, and more so than we saw in Michigan, white voters are as well, but it's not that dramatic. It's not that dramatic. All right, let's jump into the two variable breakdowns here. So when we look at both age and sex, once again, look at those 25 to 49-year-old age ranges where there are just enormous gender gaps. Enormous. When we look at low propensity environmental voters, not only in New Jersey, but also in Michigan, the largest bulk of them by far are these women aged 25 to 49. Moreover, that's also where we see the most dramatic gender gaps. Okay, when we look at race combined with sex, again, we see the gender gap at its most dramatic among white people. So what do I mean by at its most dramatic? Well, when you look at white men in New Jersey, they are underrepresented in our target population. By which I mean, if you look at the voters who EVP is targeting, there are fewer white men than there are as a percentage of the overall electorate. If you were just targeting all registered voters, white men would make up a bigger part of it. But they make up a much smaller part of our target population. But white women are dramatically overrepresented in our target population. Now you'll see with AAPI voters, it's the same thing. It doesn't look as dramatic, but actually it's even more dramatic among AAPI voters. It just doesn't seem that way because the numbers are small. But look at that. The difference between AAPI women making up only 3.9% of the New Jersey electorate, yet they make up 6.3% of our target population. That's really dramatic. That's really dramatic. All right. When we combine age and race, again, Hispanic voters, even to a more extent than what we saw in Michigan, are really underrepresented in our target population. This is a trend that we have seen consistently over the past 6 years. 6 years ago, Hispanics were overrepresented. So they were maybe the racial group that was most likely to list climate as their top priority. And that has consistently gone down, 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 down. When we look at AAPI voters, they continue to be overrepresented in our target population. And where it's most dramatic is among these 25 to 34-year-olds. And then again, when we look at 25 to 34-year-old and 35 to 49-year-old white voters, again, we see that they really skew towards our target population. They are the most likely to be environmentalists. Okay, so again, I realize I just threw a whole lot of data at you, but in a nutshell, what this means is this target population of ours in New Jersey is disproportionately women, especially middle-aged women. Middle-aged isn't really the right word to use. Let's say millennial and young Gen X women, young Gen X women. It is also disproportionately AAPI, or Asian American and Pacific Islander. All right. When we look at a congressional district breakdown in New Jersey, there are currently 3 congressional districts that the Cook Political Report rates as likely to be competitive in a year and a half. The 5th, the 7th, and the 9th. And as you'll see, we have a lot of targets, especially in the 5th and the 7th, the Gottheimer and Tom Keene Jr. districts. Now again, all of these numbers will be smaller next year, because next year, what makes an unlikely voter is different from what makes one in an odd year, even though there's a gubernatorial election. But oh my gosh, are our targets at their greatest volume in some really high leverage places. All right. This year in New Jersey, we are looking to raise $1 million. Now that means we would only be spending about $1.30 per target voter. But we feel like if we are able to raise $1 million, we can have really, really robust phone campaigns, both during the primary and the general, and then robust digital ad and direct mail campaigns. As is the case with Michigan, we don't yet know if we will be canvassing or postcarding in New Jersey. We need to do more research. We don't want to launch postcarding or canvassing campaigns unless we are confident that they can have a real impact in a particular state. So we want to dig more into the data there. As was the case with Michigan, we have a unique donation link for New Jersey. If you want to just support our mobilization efforts in New Jersey, you can donate through the link that will be in the chat, and all of the money that's donated through that link will go right to our New Jersey efforts. All right, we are almost at the Q&A. I know your head is packed full with data, but before we get to the Q&A, let me just close by saying this. You are here on a Thursday morning, if you're on the West Coast, on an early Thursday afternoon, or late morning if you're in Central or East Coast, because you're really worried. These are really bleak times we are living in. And my guess is many of you are grasping for ways to make a difference. Many of you are probably wondering, do we just have to live like this for another 2 years or 4 years? Do we just need to sit and watch all of this happen? Or can we do something? And I'm very proud to say that with the Environmental Voter Project, you can do something. We are going to be active in hundreds of elections this year across all 21 of our states. But in Michigan and New Jersey in particular, we've got elections coming up in June, July, August, and then we're going to be mobilizing for the November elections all fall. And so if you want to donate to support our work, please click on one of the links in the chat. All donations help. Big donations help a lot more. The sky is the limit. If you're interested in donating by check or by wire or by stock gift, we will put that link in the chat as well, where you can find all of that information. But please donate, and donate generously. We also really appreciate monthly donations. If you want to spread your donations out, not only might that be easier for you, but it makes budgeting easier for us, because then we can rely on getting this steady stream of data, of funding coming in, rather. 2, volunteer. If you go to our website, to the Get Involved tab, there are always a huge number of volunteer opportunities. And once you get trained, then you're off on your own. If you get trained to phone bank with us, and we have a training at the beginning of every phone bank, you can then get all the information you need by email whenever we open up new campaigns, and you can just call whenever you want. And here's the best part. We only put up a phone campaign in places where, again, we've identified people we know to be low propensity environmental voters, and we only give you scripts that have been proven to work in previous randomized control trials. This stuff works. You'll also see on our Get Involved page opportunities to canvass and postcard as they become available. We just finished our most recent postcarding campaign, but sign up if you're not signed up already to get our emails, and you will get notified once the next one opens up. And then finally, if you are interested in hosting a small Zoom meeting, so not a webinar like this where you can't see each other, but a Zoom meeting with your group or with your friends to introduce them to the Environmental Voter Project, boy, would I love to set that up. You can reach out to me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. We can set up a meeting. It will be a very light ask. We're not going to shake money out of them or demands that they volunteer. We just want to introduce our work to them. But then, yeah, we're going to very proudly offer to them all of the ways that they can start having an impact, just like we're doing right now. So we'll get to the Q&A, but I want to close before the Q&A just by saying thank you. Thank you for being here. I know these are hard times. Believe me, I feel it the same way you do. But I am so happy that you are excited about our expansion and that you want to re-engage. You should see our phone banks. Shannon was telling me that we have more people on our phone banks this year, January and February, not just compared to previous odd years, but compared to last year, a presidential election year. People are getting back in the game. And if you want to as well, boy, are we ready for you. All right. Let's get to our questions.
All right, we just had a flurry of questions. So I'm going to start us off with some of the earlier questions that we had from folks. This question came from 2 different folks in similar ways, Gina and Alan. As we see the shifts in low propensity environmental voter demographic data, do you think part of it is that previous demographics, like younger people who cared about climate, are voting more than they were before, making them less likely to be low propensity? Or do you think older folks, for example, are caring about climate more than in the past?
Really, really good questions, Gina and Alan. So there's some stuff that we know and some stuff that we don't know. What we know is, no, young people are not voting more. In fact, young people are voting less than they have in recent history. So that is definitely not happening. So for those of you who might not sort of get the nuance in Gina and Alan's questions here, it is possible that we are seeing fewer really young people in our target audience because we only target awful voters. And so if young people are getting better at voting, by definition, there would be a smaller percentage of them in our target populations. A really shrewd question to ask. But no, that's not what is going on. Overall turnout rates of young voters are going down. At least they went down in 2024. So that is not what is going on. What we also know is going on is that older people are, well, greater numbers of older people are coming to care deeply about climate and the environment. We are seeing that in our data to the extent we do polling, and we don't do much polling at the Environmental Voter Project. But we're also seeing that in the polling data of other great organizations who do a lot of great climate polling, like Yale Program on Climate Change Communications and Pew Research. So we also know that that's going on. The third thing, and this wasn't alluded to in your questions, Gina and Alan, but I do think it's worth bringing up, even though this is something we don't know, but it might be happening. And that is, maybe there is also just a significant number of 18 to 24-year-olds who are retaining their strong prioritization of climate and environmental issues as they get older. And we're just seeing them sort of pass through into a different demographic subgroup. Now, for a whole bunch of reasons, that's harder to measure. And so we don't know it for sure. But it would make sense. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier in my presentation, that it is pretty clear that there's a significant difference between people who attained voting age, so people who became 18 in the time of Trump, and people who became 18 prior to the time of Trump. Obviously, those people are getting older because all people get older. But that demarcation, even as it moves throughout demographic subgroups, is still pretty stark. It's a pretty dramatic demarcation. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there is a third thing going on here, Gina and Alan, and that is just that some of these people who were 18 to 24-year-olds 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago and cared deeply about climate and the environment still care about climate and the environment. They're just not 18 to 24-year-olds anymore. But really, really good question.
Great. Another question that we had is, do we contact these voters more than once, or do we just try to get each of them, before whatever big election's coming up?
Really, really great question. So yes, 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 we absolutely contact them more than once. And I mean that in every sense of the phrase. So we contact them multiple moments in time. So if people have multiple elections throughout the year, we are going to take advantage of all of those different and distinct bites at the apple. Whenever there is an election, even if it's a library trustee race, we are going to use it as a behavioral intervention opportunity. Because I know it sounds obvious, but it's still worth stating. The only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote in an election. So our approach is like, how dare we let an opportunity pass us by without having a really good reason not to use it to talk to voters? Then second, even within the context of a particular election, do we contact voters more than once? Well, this depends on resources, and it depends on the different types of interventions we're using in that election. If we have the money and the volunteers during a particular election, we might call someone, send them digital ads, and send them direct mail or postcards or knock on their door. And so because of that, they are getting multiple interventions. And that's important, by the way. A lot of people always worry, like, oh, is there going to be overlap? Is this person already going to be spoken to? I'm sorry, I hate to break it to you, but talking to one person once isn't enough to get them to do anything, like anything at all. And so, yeah, it's really, really important for us to layer multiple types of communication when we're contacting these people. Now, do we contact them multiple times through the same communication medium? Usually not. If we call someone and we reach them and we have a conversation with them, chances are we're not going to call them again right before their election unless they tell us, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote early. And then we see, because we have real time information on who votes early and who doesn't. If someone tells us, yeah, I'm going to vote and I'm going to vote early, and then we see that early voting's about to end and they haven't voted, sometimes we will call them again and we'll use it. It's a very like strong behavioral hook. We'll say, hey, Shannon, 3 weeks ago you told us you were going to vote early. Early voting is ending in 2 days, and we see you haven't voted yet. Can we provide you with some information on early voting hours near you? Sometimes we will do that, but that's the rare occasion where we will contact someone multiple times over the same medium for one election.
Great. All right. Next question. Why don't we tell voters who to vote for? This question came from Jenny and a whole bunch of other folks that asked similar questions about endorsements and things like that.
Yeah, great question, Jenny, and others. Uh, we would not be able to do that and retain our nonprofit status. So there are very good legal reasons for us not doing it. We would then have to, if we wanted to be active in 300 elections this year, we would probably have to form 300 different entities, file for all 300, have to abide by a whole bunch of paperwork. I mean, everything that we do would become certainly 5 times more time intensive and probably 3 times more expensive. So that's one reason. But the second reason, and I think this is in many ways just as important, even though it's not as obvious, is we take more of a demand side approach to the political marketplace. And here's what I mean by that. I think most people think of politics from the supply side. Their basic theory of change is, hey, let's elect the right people and we'll get the right policy. And don't get me wrong, boy, is it important to elect the right people. I come from a background in electoral politics. I've run probably 50 different candidate campaigns. Believe me, I understand the value in that. But you should also see what's missing in that approach. And that is, first of all, boy, is it really hard to elect good climate candidates if there aren't many voters who care deeply about climate change. But then, second, even when we do elect good climate leaders, we all know it isn't like they can then just snap their fingers and get everything they want done, right? No, of course not. They still need to pick and choose what to spend their political capital on. And they ain't going to spend it on something that almost no voters list as their top priority. And let me give you some really important data on this. In the 2020 presidential election, if you look at exit polls, 4% of voters, just 4%, listed climate or the environment as their top priority. If we fast forward to the 2024 election that just happened last fall, it did go up to 7%. Yay. But oh my God, is that nowhere close to where we need it to be? When only 7% of voters list an issue as their top priority, that makes it incredibly easy, even for good climate leaders, to ignore that issue. Where we want climate change to be is where immigration was this year. Think about how Kamala Harris had to deal with immigration. Do you think Kamala Harris wanted to talk about immigration in the last presidential campaign? No way. But she had no choice. Because in every single poll you looked at, 15 to 25% of voters listed it as their number one priority. She couldn't ignore that issue, even if it was something that she didn't want to talk about. That's where we need climate change to be. And the best way to get it there is to use this behavioral science-informed messaging to find these non-voting environmentalists and just get them to vote. And here's the last thing I'll just say, because I realize this has been a long answer, but it's a really, really good question. Not only for legal reasons can we not tell people who to vote for, not only is it really important to build up demand for climate leadership, rather than just taking the supply side approach. Although, again, don't get me wrong, it's really important to also elect the right people, but other great groups do that. But the third thing is this: study after study after study shows that the most effective voter turnout messaging is the stuff that doesn't mention candidates. And so we also would, in some ways, be losing our most effective weapons if we decided to ignore those first two things that we said. So, again, it's a very, very good question, Jenny, and it comes from a really honest place, and it's something that we all struggle with. Believe me, we're all political animals too. We're not nonpartisan because we're like these wishy-washy people who like fetishize moderation or something like that. Like, no, we want to build political power for the climate movement, period. And this is the best way to do it.
All right, I have one more question. I think it's similar to what you just got to, but a few people have said they're just feeling discouraged after what we saw in 2024 and what we're seeing now. What's your advice for getting past this despair, for lack of a better word?
Yeah. Well, first, it's a really honest and understandable reaction to objectively scary and sad times, right? Like, I'm not going to try to convince you that things aren't as bad as you think. Things are really bad. And when things are really bad and scary, to then have your reaction be fear, well, that's that's actually a very understandable reaction. And I also just think it's healthy to understand that your feelings have merit. People talk about like toxic positivity all the time, but I think it's important to just recognize that, like, feeling that you should always be happy at a time of like sadness and fear, it, it's not going to help anybody. However, certainly we don't want to wallow in despair either. And all of us are here for a reason. We want to change society and change it for the better. And we want to change, in particular, our politics and our climate policy that's made. So, my advice is just one person's advice, but I am one person who is forced to live politics and the climate crisis each day. So maybe I think about it even more about like how to do this. And I think about a few things. First, what I always have control over is where to put my own attention. What do I choose to focus on? Do I choose to focus my own attention on big, far off, uncontrollable, scary things? Even though they are real and even though they are objectively scary, do I choose to focus on them? Even though I have a very small, almost infinitesimal ability to change them? Or do I choose to focus my time and attention on things right in front of me that I can do and that I can change? I think often of Albert Camus' myth of Sisyphus, where he wants us to imagine Sisyphus rolling his boulder up the hill, not necessarily as a tragic character who is condemned to this awful fate, but as someone who has been able to find purpose and happiness in literally what is right in front of him, this task. And believe me, I'm not claiming that we have a like Sisyphusian task in front of us. I don't think we do. But what I do know is that you will be happier, you will be more fulfilled, and yes, you will be more impactful if you do the stuff that's right in front of you. And so, yeah, I'm going to bring it home by mentioning to you that right now you can go to our website and sign up for phone banks to mobilize climate first voters in important elections around the country. You will get trained. You will be given a script that has been proven to work in randomized control trials, and you can start making a difference. Will it change our world immediately? No, of course not. But it will help to start get new voters to the polls. It will change the outcome of elections, and it will start building the electorate that we want to see, not just in 2025, but in 2026 and beyond. And finally, make that donation. I know you're all tired. I know you made a ton of donations. I know you put in a ton of time in 2024. Believe me, I get it. I get it. But I also understand that you're looking to find a way out of despair. You're looking to find a way to have an impact. And I'm not asking you for charity. I'm not asking you for a favor. I'm asking you to help yourself and get involved and start making that impact. So donate through those links. Donate to support our work in Michigan. Donate to support our work in New Jersey. Sign up to be a monthly donor. And boy, are we both looking forward to seeing you at phone banks or postcarding or canvassings this year. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, everybody, for being a part of our work. Let's do this.